Hi there! Today I want to share a science fiction story from China with you, which I read a few years ago and which has taken on a new kind of beauty for me ever since I started teaching again. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. The story we're talking about today is The Village Teacher, written by Cixin Liu, and I'm using the translation of that story by Lanphier. That's the one I read myself when I read a short story collection by Cixin Liu called Hold Up the Sky. Cixin Liu is quite well known for his other science fiction work, especially The Three-Body Problem and The Wandering Earth, the latter of which has also been made into, I think, a blockbuster film, which I still need to watch. But I read this collection about a year or two ago, and then I also listened to an audiobook of it, narrated by Bruno Rubicek. And I thought, why not share this story? Because sometimes you read something, and then a few years later, it suddenly takes on a whole new relevance for you. As I said at the beginning, I have recently started teaching again, and ever since doing so, this story has been in the back of my mind, and I've always reflected on it when I came out of a classroom and wondered if I'd, communicated the right things, and if I'm somehow making a bit of a difference by teaching. So that's why I want to share this story with you. So what I'm going to do is cover the plot of The Village Teacher, and then I'm going to just share some of the things that came up for me when I read it again this time round. In the northwest of China, in a mountain range, there is a small village which has a village teacher. He awakens in the evening, lying in bed, gazing out of his window. The village really is small. It's rural, and it becomes more cheerful during national holidays when all the young people come back, but once the holidays are over, they return to the cities in search for work. On top of that, the village is struggling through its 5th year of drought. It truly is a bit of a desolate place, but the village teacher can hear his students moving about outside his room, and he's developed a bit of an intuition for them. He can pick them out by their sounds and their figures after a lifetime of teaching. Most of his students stay at the school with him, even if they live in the village, because the minimal provisions that he can provide for them there are still better than their lives at home. They cook their own meals, they have their own bedding, and their presence warms his heart. At a certain point, they had an electricity outage, which he now thinks about again, during an evening class, and he had to light candles one by one and stopping at 3 because, there's not that many candles. But he lit them in the hope that they could still see the blackboard so he could continue teaching them. There's always more material to cover, after all, more to try and teach them. He had looked at the children in the firelight, and it's an image that has remained embedded in his mind, even though he's not quite sure why. As he lies in bed pondering, the children are burning incense for him outside, a superstition. He has been trying to teach them about science and about culture, but he no longer has the strength or the energy to correct them. You see, about half a year ago, the villagers had come to the school trying to pull the roof apart in order to fix a temple. The teacher had fought them off, but he broke 2 ribs in the process. Someone was kind enough to take him to the hospital, but there he was told that he had esophageal cancer. Not to worry though, said the doctor, it hadn't metastasized yet, so they could operate, and then it would all turn out good. The doctor could even lower the cost to only 20,000 yuan. The teacher listens to him, asks how much time he would have without the surgery, and leaves. There is no way he could afford the surgery. While he lived a relatively frugal life, he had spent all his savings and all his money on his students. He would pay their tuition if their parents would otherwise not let them come. He would cover expenses. He would provide food. And so there is no money left. He wanders to the train station, and he's once again pondering his life. He does accept the path that he has chosen, which was inspired by his own teacher's sacrifice. He had returned to the village after taking his teacher's test and had decided to do his very best. But the region was poor, and their struggle had made the villagers a little apathetic. He didn't make himself very popular either as village teacher, encouraging all the children to attend rather than following their parents to work. He had become weighed down by the tired eyes of the villagers, but he had pushed on until now. He spends his last money buying books for the school library and takes the train home. Meanwhile, in the center of the Milky Way, 15,000 light years from Earth, a 20,000-year-long interstellar war is about to come to an end. See, the carbon-based Federation had been battling the silicon-based empire for all these years, and while the beginning of the war is something of a distant memory, it does still remain vivid. The silicon-based empire had used the energy of stars to jump from solar system to solar system, creating supernovas and black holes, laying waste to countless of planets. Now the silicon-based empire has been pushed to the farthest fringes of the galaxy, and it is time to end the war once and for all. As traveling took place by using the energy from stars, the Federation has decided to create an isolation belt by eliminating tens of thousands of stars, thereby preventing the silicon-based empire from using them to jump about. This zone should take shape in the spiral arm 1 of the Milky Way. In the fleet's main ship, the High Archon, leader of the Federation, is gathered with the Senator and the fleet commander. The Senator politely reminds the High Archon that the Senate has requested that they do civilization tests on the planets within the zone. The war is almost over, and it is time now to begin valuing all forms of life again. The High Archon agrees, although he and the fleet commander do also value the ending of the war quite highly. But they assure themselves this arm of the Milky Way is an absolute wasteland, so they're not very likely to find level 3C civilizations there. Meanwhile, in the mountains, 6 months after his diagnosis, the village teacher is using his last breaths to continue teaching his students. They are gathered around his bed this evening by candlelight, and they beg him to rest and just continue tomorrow, but he knows that there will be no tomorrow for him. Yesterday, he taught them about Lucian's Diary of a Madman, which he hopes they will understand when they're older, but for now he just encourages them to reread it and to memorize it if they can. Today's lesson is about Newton's laws. While he's doing so, the carbon-based Federation has arrived at the right arm of the Milky Way and begins its first 3C civilization test. On the planet they've located, with a tempestuous atmosphere, there lives some kind of balloon-shaped creature. So they do a full 4D scan, bring one of these creatures in as a digital replica, and then come a series of questions. The test works this way. They have a whole data bank of questions which are meant to test a civilization to see how far it has developed. Of these questions, 3 need to be passed. If the first 3 questions are failed, the tester can choose to continue or just decide to end the test straight away. And so, they pose the first question to this balloon-shaped creature. This creature answers in dee-dee-doos, which means they fail the questions. The fleet fires a singularity bomb, which is apparently smaller than an atom but has an enormous mass, and they fire this towards the target star. The senator mourns the loss of another species, and he begs them to do another scan in this region. Meanwhile, the teacher has turned to Newton's second law. He hopes it is enough, but he can feel his mind slipping. He thinks again of the candlelight and of the candles he would place. He can no longer see the students, but he can hear them, and he vows to burn as brightly as possible for them, for as long as possible. They've understood, they said, and they want him to rest now. He knows that they haven't fully understood, but he repeats the laws again, and with his last breath asks them to recite the laws to him. In tears they do so, and the teacher's candle burns out. The Federation scan has located a new planetary system. It's a lovely-looking system, and they scan random sites on each planet, one after the other. Each planet is empty, and the fleet commander says, okay, we're wasting time. Let's get the singularity bomb in there. But the High Archon has a feeling about the third planet, so he requests that it gets tested extensively. The first beam hits a small patch of land in Asia, the mountains of northwest China to be precise, and it hits the village school right on. The beam sorts through the different life forms it is detecting and then creates something of a holographic image of the school for the High Archon. He's not really impressed with the species he discovers there, but he requests a 4D scan, which transmits the minutest details about the school and the children to the spaceship's computer, which means that the students can be kind of reassembled into a digital replica. And so the next civilization test begins. There are questions about the principles of evolution, about the power of a star, about the chemical composition of the liquid, and the kids have no idea what's happening. The digital replicas of these students have been projected into this massive spaceship, and they're not quite sure where they are, and these questions do not make sense. They have no idea. So they remain silent until they hit question 10. The fleet commander is absolutely done now. He says 10 questions is more than enough. We're once again wasting time. The High Archon agrees, and so the singularity bomb is prepped. But the High Archon does ask when the bomb will reach the Earth's sun. He's told 10 minutes to impact, so he chooses to continue the test for 5 more minutes before they will need to exit the blast radius. Question 11 is about the relationship between the 3 sides of a right triangle, and there's nothing there. The students are also asked about their planet's position within the solar system, and they have no idea. And at this point, the fleet commander is just really over it. But then the 13th question is about how an object moves when it is not subjected to any external forces. And the digital replicas of the children begin to recite Newton's first law. The next question is answered with the second law. Question 15 can be answered by the final law. And that's 3 questions answered successfully, confirming the presence of a 3C civilization. The High Archon immediately issues a command that the singularity bomb should be withdrawn, pulled back, somehow stopped, and it's a very close call. The entire galaxy seems to watch as the bomb slowly but surely veers away, just narrowly missing our sun. The students down in the village, meanwhile, are mourning their teacher, utterly unaware of what their digital counterparts just experienced above. Should they maybe get an adult? Well, they know their teacher wasn't very popular, so they choose to bury him themselves, digging a grave under a sky full of stars. The senator, meanwhile, pores over their test results once again, and he thinks that, in fact, Earth has a 5B civilization rather than 3C, meaning they've discovered nuclear fission and that they even landed on the moon. He is astounded, especially once he realizes that Earth has no collective shared memory, but that knowledge is transmitted from person to person, across generation, by individuals known as teachers. This is a prehistoric concept to them. It is an ancient word, teacher. It is rare in their federation. And so they gaze at the blue orb of Earth and realize that it's a civilization that is developing completely independently by people sharing their dreams and ideas with each other. The High Archon decides that they should be left undisturbed, so that this miracle of civilization, of dreams, songs, and wonder can develop in its own way. And that is The Village Teacher by Cixin Liu. A really interesting science fiction story in my eyes. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the reasons why I like it. And of course, I'm always happy to hear what you thought as well. One of the reasons I like The Village Teacher so much is that it really kind of plays with your expectations. So you get into this story, you kind of get settled into it, and you're encountering this village teacher, and he's an incredibly interesting and empathetic character. His drive to educate his students, his affection for them, even though he's also, I think, quite a strict teacher, probably, it really comes forward very strongly. And then the fact that you know he's ill, and then you find out that he was unable to afford his surgery, and that kind of his life is coming to an end, it's quite heartbreaking. And you have this image of this aging teacher sitting on a train back to his village with his last money spent on books for his students rather than his own health. And then suddenly the story switches to this intergalactic, interstellar war taking place between a federation and an empire, and one of them is silicon-based and the other is carbon-based. And if you're anything like me, which means that science intimidates you a little bit, then that is quite a shift. Like, you know that Cixin Liu writes science fiction, but still, suddenly you're taken out of this story of the village teacher and you're in the middle of this war that is about to come to an end. The stakes are suddenly completely different, and when I first read the story, I was not quite sure what the relevance between these two different storylines was going to be. I was like, well, they're probably going to get to Earth, but am I just meant to feel sad for this teacher and these kids if they get blown up? Like, what's going to happen? And then slowly but surely, these kind of storylines begin to be intertwined. And I really like the way that this kind of almost cold and detached way of looking at civilizations is then, which the Federation is doing, is then contrasted to this teacher's consistent effort to try and give his students as much knowledge as possible. And what Cixin Liu does really well, I think, is describe the situation of this village. The fact that, it's experiencing a brain drain because the young people have to leave, which means the village is kind of stuck in its old ways. It can't really get along. It's not quite sure how to innovate, if there's anything that they can do to get past this drought or to give their children different opportunities. And the figure of this teacher is quite divisive because of that in the village, because he's constantly pushing towards teaching these children, giving them other opportunities, whereas the kind of poverty and hardship has kind of dulled the instincts of the other villagers a bit. And his passion, even though it is calm and a bit more muted towards the end of his life, it's still so bright, and that contrasts just beautifully to this perhaps a little colder galactic view that we get. That kind of passion also comes through really clearly in the imagery of the candle and the candlelight. And I hadn't really noticed that as much the first time I read it, but upon rereading it for the podcast now, it kind of really struck me how this image of a candle is so fused into the teacher's mind, and he identifies himself with the candle as well. He's like, I want to be the light in the darkness which burns for these students. I want to use my light to show them more than they could otherwise envision. And then in the end, when his candle burns out and when he comes to his end, it is really heartbreaking. And you also understand why these students feel so devoted to him and are so heartbroken at his death, because he did represent a different kind of life for them. So, of course, as a teacher, I find that very touching. I don't necessarily think I'm changing lives in the way that this village teacher is, but it is nice to see a story kind of engaging with the act of teaching, with that tradition we have of passing the knowledge we have on to others, to carry that knowledge and wisdom kind of across generations. And the village teacher does that both by sharing Newton's laws, but also trying to share Chinese literature with his students and to give them both sides, right? To enrich the entirety of their life, even though he's aware that maybe they won't be able to do anything with this knowledge, but at least they'll have it, and hopefully it will make their lives better to have these things to reflect upon. And I think that's just very beautiful. Another thing I think is very beautiful kind of is the end. The fact that, the world is basically balanced on a knife's edge, and that actually we've tipped over the edge, and that our civilization seems to have failed at these different tests until the High Archon decides to kind of keep going because of an instinct. And I've always pondered, and I don't necessarily have clear thoughts on this per se, but I also wonder if there is a certain kind of commentary that Cixin Liu is putting in there as well. I mean, I'm sure he is in the entirety of the story, but specifically in the moment where these kids are failing these tests with questions that may seem logical or easy to answer to other members of the reading audience. So there are plenty of questions where I was like, wait, how does a triangle work again? I don't know. But I could explain our position in the solar system. I could explain how evolution works on our planet and with our species, right? Where you're like, oh, I've learned these things. Okay, great. And I wonder whether there's, like I said, kind of an implicit commentary maybe that Cixin Liu is trying to transmit to the readers as well, to be like, well, you're reading this book, you're interested in science fiction, and maybe he presupposes a certain level of education there as well. And maybe he's trying to then, by contrasting that with these kind of rural farm children who don't know as much, who only know what they know because of the passion of one person, that we shouldn't judge them in a sense. And the fact that they then can answer the next 3 questions, not necessarily because they understand the laws, but purely because someone has cared enough to try and teach them, right? Not because they're kind of special chosen one little children, but because someone cared about them enough. And so that in the sense, our civilization and our planet at the end of the story is saved not necessarily by the fact that we have Newton's laws, but by the fact that we are committed enough to each other to try and communicate those things, to try and explain to each other how the world works. I think that's really nice. And well, as you can probably tell, I haven't necessarily formulated that in a very clear or precise way, but I think that's a beautiful thing to find in a science fiction story that somehow combines rural life with intergalactic warfare, and Newton's laws with poetry. While I do think that the ending of the story kind of goes on for quite a bit, I think a story that would have wanted to be snappier would have probably finished straight after the kids answer the right questions and the singularity bomb is kind of withdrawn. That's probably would have been a place to end the story, which might feel logical. But what I do like is how Cixin Liu shows the way in which the kind of Federation leaders reflect and how they look at our planet and realize that, we haven't pooled all of our memories into a data bank, which means that we can't download all the knowledge of the world, right? We have to find teachers, we have to find books, we have to communicate these things to each other, rather than have immediate access to it. And I think even with the internet, that is still true. In a way, the internet, combines all of the world's knowledge in a sense, but in order for it to make sense, you do still have to communicate with other human beings as well. When I was doing the episode on The Haunting of Hill House, for example, and I briefly spoke about non-Euclidean geometry, I was looking that up on the internet and they explain it and I'm still not getting it. So I had to speak to my father about it, who understands these things, and then he could explain it in more detail, and that way I could understand it. So it's about this sharing of knowledge, but it's also about the impact it has on the Federation, who is so used to different ways of knowledge communication, and they kind of have to reassess their own judgments of what a good civilization is and how we should progress. And there is a really nice scene at the end about the High Archon and how he's so touched by the fact that Earth has teachers and that Earth commits to sharing its knowledge, that he kind of digs back into his own sort of archival memories and he finds an ancient song of his own civilization and starts singing that. And it brings all that kind of culture and beauty and knowledge together into kind of a really nice, touching moment. So yeah, I think those are some of my thoughts on this story. You're getting them in a bit of a rougher form perhaps than usual, but I really just wanted to share my interest in this story with you, and I hope you get something out of it. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.